I'd like to make one comment. I was at Stony Brook just shortly before John was, and I think that the description of John underplays his significance, because I also was at MIPS Computer System. I knew all the people that did Atheros with him and the patents that went from Atheros from Stanford or whatever. But so what he brought to the game was, he brought, I call it intellectual honesty. And him and John Massey were the ones who sort of drove us forward. And it was an intellectual honesty in how you do an optimization of the machine, the compilers with Fred Chow and all those guys, that doesn't really exist too much in a lot of startups. I've done 8 startups. MIPS was one of the 8s we did IPO. But my question is, in general, is about, John sits on the board of Cisco. I work for Cisco, and you talk about the classic inventor's dilemma of invalidating this product with ODMs. Cisco's position, since I work in the chip division now, is that the ODMs really are arms merchants. They depend upon merchant silicon that's only done by 1 or 2 players in the valley. One, for example, like everybody talks about these bulk switches that are being driven off of now by Broadcom silicon. And if you really look at the history, like Andy Bechtelstein said when he did Arista, you can't do bulk silicon like that unless you can produce somewhere between 400, 800,000 units a year of this thing to sell, because you can't get the return on investment. So you really have this kind of dilemma with the ODMs. I think that basically they're sort of like milking the top off the thing. They don't really have any design expertise. They don't have the thing that people that won't really appreciate about it is the level of complexity of the software that's in these machines. And they trivialize it. So I read them all the time. You know, we follow the software networking stuff all the time. And I think that the question really comes down to is how do you really institutionalize that? Since John's on the board of Cisco with Chambers, how do you inject that into the carcass of Cisco to sort of say you have to reinvent yourself? And the second point I want to ask about is Apple last year, if you look at the financials of Apple Computers, spent almost $10 billion in China sending equipment into Foxconn, building manufacturing capabilities. There was no reason why Apple couldn't spend the money in the United States. It's because that was the easiest path to investment. So it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Either the Valley has to get off its ass and decide that there's worthwhile to invest in the United States rather than investing in education in China, you know, rather than having this cycle perpetuate itself. But since you're on the board, how do you inject that conversation into Chambers?
Yeah, so there are 2 issues that a well-established technical company like Cisco has to address. One is protecting your core and ensuring that your core products remain competitive. You can get some nipping at the edge. If, for example, those white boxes stay down at the very low end and never climb up the value chain, you're just fine. The observation people sometimes make is that you start at the low end of the value chain, and then as your capability grows at the low end, if demand for higher end products does not continue to grow, what happens is or the needs of them, those products simply migrate down and they're able to run with what was the low end and now offers much more capability. Classic story, you want to see this, look at the interplay between Silicon Graphics and NVIDIA. NVIDIA, I mean, a lot of the founders were from Silicon Graphics. They put that technology in a PC framework rather than a large engineering workstation framework, and basically reduced the cost dramatically. So you've got that problem. The other problem, there's a problem that the big players in the computer industry all share. Shared by Microsoft, shared by Cisco, shared by Intel, in an earlier time shared by IBM. You have a main product line. It's most of your revenue. It makes a lot of money. It has great margins associated with it. Now you want to branch into new product lines. You've got to diversify. You're making money here, but this core market isn't growing, right? Cisco's big core market is not growing very fast. Most of the there are a few competitors, there's Juniper, a few others, but they are the largest provider. That's true for Microsoft in the enterprise software market. It's true for Intel in the microprocessor market. Now, so your core market isn't growing, but you're making a lot of money. You now need to diversify. So you pick up the revenue and you got to find another market to diversify. The problem is there is no other market that A, is going to deliver comparable margins. They're not out there. So you're looking at markets that deliver less attractive margins. And B, it's very hard to find a market to move into that can begin to move the needle when you're a $40 or $50 billion company. It's just very hard. New markets start off at $1 billion. And you get a new market, even if you're got in the beginning, from day one, you have 50% of the market. That's $500 million. It's nothing in a $40 billion company to have an extra $500 million of revenue. That's the kind of innovator's dilemma that these companies see. You're exactly right. I think in terms of manufacturing, so a number of years ago, President Obama came out to the Valley, and about 14 of us had dinner with him. Some venture capitalists, Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, a number of the other, LinkedIn founder, Reed Hastings from Netflix. And we talked about this manufacturing issue. And I think the president wanted to see what could be done to return manufacturing. And this challenge of hiring the engineering talent, but manufacturing-oriented engineer talent. We're probably not going to house those people in the Valley because they're not going to get paid as much as run-of-the-mill engineers in the Valley. They're going to have a hard time surviving here. We're probably going to have to find another place to put them, whether that's somewhere in Texas or it's somewhere less expensive than the Valley. But if we can build that workforce and locate that, I think we have a shot at doing it. But it's going to require a commitment of everybody along the way to really make it happen and to make sure we have the workforce to really tackle it. But I think it can be done, but I think if we don't move on this soon, it's going to be too late to move on it.
Just to elaborate, there were two questions there, and the first question had to do with intended obsolescence of products, and you might not all be techies in the audience. So Cisco's main product is switch routers, and as Professor Hennessy said, they're making a lot of money because they have a lot of profit margin per unit, but that market isn't growing, and worse, it's being supplanted by white label boxes and bare metal switches, which are much lower in price.